I was punished for speaking my own language. They washed my mouth with soap, made me stand in the corner until my legs shook, and told me that Navajo was a dirty word. Funny thing is, that same language would one day save thousands of American lives. My name is Chester Nez. I was born in 1921 in a small log house on the Navajo Nation, out in the dry hills of New Mexico, where the wind never stops moving and the stars look close enough to touch. Back then, our world felt far away from America's wars. My family herded sheep, prayed in our own tongue, and believed words carried power, the kind of power that could heal or destroy. When I was 8, government agents came and took me to a boarding school hundreds of miles away. The teachers cut my hair, burned my clothes, and told me I had to forget the language of my people. Every time I slipped and said a Navajo word, they made me scrub floors or stand under the sun until I nearly fainted. After a while, I stopped talking altogether. I remember lying in bed at night, whispering words into my blanket so no one could hear, afraid, but not willing to let them die. Years later, when war came, I was 20 and trying to find work in Gallup. That's when the government called. They said the Marines needed strong young men who could serve their country. I didn't know what they really wanted from me. I just knew the world was at war and I wanted to do my part. I packed my few belongings, a pair of boots, a blanket, and a small pouch of sacred corn pollen from my grandmother, and boarded a bus heading west. As the desert rolled past the window, I looked out at the red cliffs and whispered a few words in Navajo. The same words that once brought punishment. I couldn't have known then that those words, the ones they told me to forget, would soon become America's most powerful weapon against the Empire of Japan. Not long after I joined the Marines, a strange rumour spread through the barracks. Some said a white man had come to Camp Elliott with a wild idea. He wanted to use the Navajo language as a military code. Most of us laughed. To outsiders, Navajo just sounded like wind scraping over stone, too fast and too rough to follow. But that man, Philip Johnston, wasn't just guessing. He'd grown up on our reservation, spoke our language like one of us, and believed it could protect American lives. The officers didn't buy it. They'd seen plenty of crazy wartime schemes and they figured this was another. So Johnston arranged a demonstration. Inside a small communications room, 4 Navajo Marines sat at one end, 4 more at the other, each group with a field radio. The officers stood with their arms crossed, waiting to be entertained. Johnston handed the first group a short written message, a real Marine order in plain English. "Ready?" he said. "Send it." The men spoke into the radio in Navajo, calm and quick. On the other side, the second group listened, then translated the message back into English without missing a single word. The whole thing took 20 seconds. Silence filled the room. One of the officers glanced at his stopwatch and said quietly, 20 seconds. The M209 cipher takes 30 minutes. No one laughed after that. For the first time, they saw what our language could do. That night they asked for volunteers. I signed my name without thinking twice. In May 1942, 29 of us met at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. Some were ranch hands, some carpenters, some barely out of school. None of us looked like secret weapon material, just a bunch of Navajo boys with dusty boots and shy grins. Johnston spoke to us before we began training. "Your language," he said, "can save thousands of lives." His words hung in the air like a prayer. We didn't yet know how, but we felt the weight of what he was asking. I looked around that room and realized this wasn't just about fighting a war. It was about giving back the very thing America once tried to take from us, our voice. They locked us inside a small building at Camp Elliott, guards posted at every door. Nobody outside knew what we were doing, not even the other Marines. Inside, 29 of us sat at wooden desks, radios stacked in the corners, chalk dust in the air. For 8 weeks we worked to build something that had never existed before, a military code built entirely from our language. We started with the things we knew. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish. A battleship was Lotso, whale. A fighter plane was Dahitihi, hummingbird. A bomber, Jaysho, buzzard. Every word had to make sense to us, easy to remember under fire but impossible for anyone else to understand. When we built the alphabet, we made it even harder to break. Each English letter had several Navajo words so no pattern could be traced. The letter E, the most common in English, could mean elk, eye, ear, or leaf, whichever came to mind first. We wrote nothing down. Every word, every phrase lived only in our heads. The officers told us that one mistake in battle could cost lives, so we drilled until our tongues were dry. Day after day, we practiced sending and receiving until the sounds felt like rhythm in our blood. Some nights I lay awake thinking about the meaning of what we were doing. For us, words were never just sounds. In our traditions, words carry life. They can heal, bless, or destroy. When I spoke into the radio, I felt as if I was calling on the spirits of my ancestors to protect the men around me. Every word was a prayer, and every mistake could be a curse. 8 weeks later, we could send messages faster than any cipher machine and never be understood by the enemy. When we marched out of that locked building, I realized something. We were no longer just Navajo boys from the reservation. We were part of a new kind of weapon, one made of memory, discipline, and the sacred power of language. The air in Guadalcanal was thick with heat and the smell of rotting jungle. Mud clung to our boots and mosquitoes swarmed like smoke. The first time I carried the radio into battle, it felt heavier than any rifle. I could hear gunfire in the distance, sharp cracks mixed with the deep rumble of artillery. Every few minutes the ground trembled and the sky flashed red through the palm trees. My hands were sweating so badly I could hardly turn the knobs on the set. That day, the order came through. Enemy machine gun nest ahead of the ridge. Our unit needed artillery coordinates fast. My partner, Joe, looked at me and said, "You're up, Chester." I took a breath, keyed the mic and spoke the words we'd spent months perfecting. Beshlo, Dehitahi. To anyone else, it sounded like broken wind across stone, but to our team miles away, it was clear as daylight, the exact coordinates of the enemy guns. 14 seconds later, shells screamed overhead. The ground shook. When the dust cleared, the nest was gone. Joe grinned through the sweat and said, "That's one for the Navajos." I just nodded. My voice was steady, but inside I was shaking. Somewhere out there, Japanese radios were catching every word we sent, trying to make sense of the sounds. I imagined their officers, men like Commander Kurihara or Lieutenant Yamada, huddled over their receivers, recording our voices, running them through machines, trying to match patterns. They'd hear rhythm, repetition, maybe even tones, but no meaning. Later we learned they thought it might be some kind of musical code. I remember thinking, let them listen all they want. That night, as I cleaned mud off the radio, I realized something. Our code wasn't just words anymore. It was armor, invisible, unbreakable. I didn't know what the Japanese heard, but I knew one thing for certain. They didn't understand a single word. Word spread through the Pacific that the Japanese were trying everything to break our code. Their intelligence men recorded hundreds of hours of Navajo messages, spinning wax cylinders day and night, hoping to find a pattern. They even captured a Navajo soldier, Joe Kiyumiya, who'd been taken prisoner at Bataan months before our code was created. The Japanese thought he was the key. They played him recordings of our voices, asking what ironfish and hummingbird meant. But Joe couldn't help them. He understood the words, but not the code behind them. The phrases made no sense to him. They weren't everyday Navajo. They were military logic wrapped inside our culture. When he said he didn't know, they beat him. When he still refused, they tortured him, hanging him by his arms, pouring water into his nose and mouth, starving him until his body shook. They told him they'd feed him if he'd translate, but he couldn't, because there was nothing to translate. Later, we heard he survived, though barely. The Japanese must have thought he was lying, but the truth was simple. Even a fluent Navajo couldn't understand our code without the training. Back in Japan, Commander Kurihara and his cryptographic team worked themselves to exhaustion. Reports say they listened to thousands of transmissions trying to find rhythm or repetition. They charted sound waves on paper, slowed them down, and even brought in linguists and Buddhist monks who studied ancient languages. Still nothing. Lieutenant Yamada once admitted after the war that they believed it might be a forgotten tribal chant. I often think about that. Those men hunched over their radios, hearing our voices but never our meaning. They could crack the army's codes, the navy's, even the diplomats', but not ours. Because our code wasn't made of numbers or machines. It was made of breath, memory, and the hearts of men who refused to forget who they were. The Japanese could break every man-made cipher, but they could never break the heart of a living language. Iwo Jima was hell made of black sand and fire. The ground burned under our boots, the air reeked of sulphur, and the noise never stopped. Every inch of that island was defended by men who'd sworn to die there. The sky was red with smoke, the sea behind us filled with ships, and the beaches littered with wreckage. I was one of 6 Navajo code talkers assigned to the front lines. For the first 48 hours, we worked without rest, sending more than 800 messages. Everyone received and answered without a single error. My fingers were raw from turning the dials, my throat hoarse from speaking, but there was no time to think, only to send. Coordinates for artillery, requests for supplies, calls for evacuation, all of it passed through the radio in our language. To anyone listening, it sounded like wind and thunder colliding, but to our Marines, it was life itself. I remember one night when the shelling was so heavy the sky glowed orange. I pressed my helmet down, leaned into the mic and whispered, "Turtle moving toward the iron fish," our code for tanks advancing near naval fire. Moments later, friendly shells roared over our heads, landing right on target. Major Howard Connor, our operations officer, said later, "During those first 2 days, I had 6 Navajo nets running around the clock. They sent over 800 messages and not one mistake. Without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Hearing that years later, I felt the weight of it. Every time I spoke into that radio, I could almost hear my ancestors beside me, their voices weaving through mine. On the other side of the island, General Kuribayashi's men were listening too. They intercepted our transmissions but couldn't read a single word. His entire defense plan, based on breaking American communications, fell apart. The battle raged on, but our code held strong. Amid the chaos, the screams, and the sulphur smoke, the sound of Navajo words rose like prayer. And in that hell, it was our voices, not our bullets, that turned the tide. On August 14th, 1945, I sat by the radio set one last time. The order came down from command, short and clear: "Transmit surrender confirmation." My hands trembled as I pressed the key and spoke the words in Navajo. "Nehemah adigini adanil." Japan has surrendered. The words carried through static and heat, crossing the ocean in a language no enemy had ever understood. When I set the handset down, the island was quiet for the first time in years. The war was over. We packed up our gear, burned our code sheets, not that we ever really needed them, and waited for the ships to take us home. I thought going home would feel like victory. But when I stepped off the train in Gallup, no one was waiting. There were no parades, no medals, no words of thanks. The program was still classified, and we were told never to speak of it, not to our families, not even to other Marines. So we stayed silent. Some of the men went back to herding sheep, some to the mines, others just disappeared into the desert. In the towns, signs still hung on restaurant doors. No Indians or dogs allowed. We'd fought for America, but America still didn't see us. Once I tried to check into a hotel wearing my Marine uniform. The clerk looked at the badge, then at my skin, and said they had no rooms. I slept in my truck that night, listening to the wind. For years I carried that silence, the kind that presses on your chest until it hurts. We were the heroes no one knew, guardians of a code we couldn't even admit existed. Sometimes, late at night, I'd turn on the radio just to hear static, to remind myself of those days when our voices meant something. The war had ended, but the silence after it lasted a lifetime, and yet, even in that quiet, I never felt shame, because I knew what we'd done, and I knew that somewhere out there, in the ashes of war, our words had carried peace. For more than 20 years after the war, we carried our silence like a secret wound. Then, in 1968, the government finally lifted the veil. The Code Talker program was declassified. I remember opening the newspaper and seeing the words in print, Navajo Code Talkers. For the first time, the world knew what we had done. It felt strange, almost unreal. People started writing letters, reporters came asking questions, and for once, we could answer. Years later, in 2001, they invited us to Washington. When I walked into the Capitol Rotunda wearing my old Marine uniform, the hall fell silent. Then, as the president entered, the room rose to its feet. I thought about the men who weren't there, Carl, Lloyd, John. The voices now gone. We stood together, the last few of us, as they placed the Congressional Gold Medal in our hands. The medal shone like the morning sun on Red Canyon walls. The president said, "Today we honor 29 Native Americans who gave their country a service only they could give." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't just about the war. It was about the language, the same language they once tried to erase, now honored by the very nation that had forbidden it. They used to tell us that being different made us weak. But on Iwo Jima, that difference saved the world. Our words, once whispered in fear, became the code that no enemy could break. Today, when I hear young Navajos speaking our language in schools, I feel peace. The code lives on, not just in museums or medals, but in every child who says their first prayer in Navajo. They say our code was never broken, and that's true. But it's more than that. The language itself, the spirit behind it, remains unbroken, just like America. A nation built from many voices, many peoples, all speaking different words, yet united in one purpose. Our language was never broken, and neither was the spirit of a country made strong by its diversity.